Hello, everyone. Dr. Bradley Wolfe, and I'm going over the chapter 13 in the public speaking project on visual aids. So visual aids are going to be involved in many presentations. Right now, I am sharing my screen of the textbook chapter as my visual aid is going through this presentation. But visual aids can take a lot of different forms. So this chapter talks about some of the different forms. Then if you are using like a slide presentation or even other images, it gives some tips on how to create effective images, graphs, visualizations of data, and things like that. So in the introduction here, it talks about how oftentimes when we talk about a visual aid, people think of a PowerPoint presentation, right? A PowerPoint presentation is one type of visual aid, but there's many types of visual aids that you can implement in a speech when you're giving a speech. So we can talk about props. If I want to give a speech, I can use this hat here, the little Luigi hat. If I'm giving a speech about the Super Mario Brothers, I can wear it. See? Not what I'm doing right now, so not necessarily the visual aid I want. I have a little Funko Pop here. Maybe I'm giving a speech on Halloween. So I use this Funko Pop from Hocus Pocus to give my speech about Halloween to show, hey, this, people dress up. We have black cats and some of the mythology behind it. I could use my cat here. She apparently wants to be my visual aid. This is Amber. So if I'm giving a speech about pets, I could, if it's a recorded presentation, I could use a cat. If you're going into the classroom to give a speech, you probably can't bring a live animal with. So again, thinking about the context and your audience, what is an appropriate visual aid for your topic, for the audience, and for the situation? So we're going to go over plenty of other types of visual aids as well, but those are just some examples. It has here a quote from Roy H. Williams. A visual aid is a simple thing, a picture that enters the eye. Another one from Alan Klein says, it has been said that 80% of what people learn is visual. So you want visual aids that are going to complement your presentation, complement the content that you're presenting, but you don't want ones that are going to overpower and take away. You don't want something that's going to distract the audience from listening to you. So again, it's about having good balance in terms of the visual aids that you use. Here's an example of a visual aid. Looks like a little art piece of a cheeseburger. So creating effective visual aids is the first part. So you should consider the specific purpose of your speech and the desired outcomes when determining if, when, and to what extent, and at what format you should use visual aids, right? You may not always use visual aids. There are many very good presentations that do not use visual aids. But if you're required to for a class, you certainly want to. So again, figuring out what visual aid is going to be appropriate. I'm a boring guy, so I tend to use PowerPoint. I have used Prezi before, but props are fun too, right? If you can find some good props to bring to a presentation, even looking at what you wear, right? When we dress up, giving a speech, you want to look halfway professional, right? You want to look like you're, credible. That builds your credibility. But you also could build your credibility by wearing, attire that fits with your presentation. If you're giving a presentation on the Army and you served in the military, you may wear your military uniform as part of it. So again, thinking about what sort of clothing you could wear that fits with your presentation, something good to think about. So visual aids are help convey your message by adding another element. So we're not just listening to your speech, we're also seeing the speech and seeing the information in some form. So again, what's effective, you don't want to write out your speech and put it on a PowerPoint, right? You don't want your audience reading your speech off the PowerPoint because that distracts them. Then they're not listening to you. They're just either reading the presentation or listening to you. They can't do both at the same time. So again, really limiting what's, what information is there that's appropriate. So it gives another example here. If a speaker might show proper and improper ways to bow when being introduced in Japan, you may be doing some of those movements. You may be doing those gestures and using yourself as a visual aid in how to bow and how to properly bow in Japanese culture, right? You may have your audience get up and do some bows, right? You may involve your audience and get them moving. So certainly that's one example of how you can involve your audience. I've got other presentations, more workshops that are about an hour long, where they're demonstration speeches where the instructor is showing you how to do something, and then it gives the audience some time to do that same thing. So I did one presentation recently where I went to where we talked about networking. So they said, okay, let's draw out our networks, right? Let's map out our networks on a piece of paper. So they handed out pieces of paper and we started drawing out some of our networks that we're engaged in. So again, there's a variety of ways to do presentations and to involve visual aids. So here's another visual aid. Again, It looks like an art piece. Someone standing against the wall and painting themselves into a corner. So what does that resemble? So you may elaborate on what this resembles in your presentation if this is one of your visual aids. So again, get some thinking about it by visually seeing what you're talking about, also adding those additional details. You're going to, again, complementing the verbal information with visual information. So we talked about types of visual aids, personal appearance. So again, you want to dress professionally, but you also could dress to fit in with your topic. Objects and props. So it says a bicycle helmet for speech on bike safety, a sample of a product you're trying to sell. So again, what sort of props are going to be appropriate for you and your situation? So it says caution passing objects around during your speech because not everyone's going to have it at the same time. So if you're trying to get them to talking about it, by the time it gets to them, you may be onto something else. And also it can distract the audience during the presentation if you're passing the thing around. If you have enough different objects to pass around where it can get to everyone, a small enough audience and enough of the object so everyone can get it within that time frame when you're talking, that can be effective. But really, if you're passing the prop around, maybe it's good to set aside for later. Hey, if you want to see this later, I have this when I'm done with my presentation. If you want a closer up look or example. So just be careful with those objects and props because they can be a distraction. That talks about demonstration speech. So it looks here like a cooking presentation. So if you're doing a cooking presentation, you can do that. I've had to do that in school where you record yourself on how to do different cooking and demonstrate how to cook. So again, there's a lot of other things you can demonstrate as well. Like I said, the network mapping is a type of demonstration that they can do and then have the audience give them a moment to do it as well. But demonstration also helps with people with different learning styles. So some people are really good with listening to the information. They can listen well and pick up information well in that format. Some people really like those visuals and they are very visual learners. Other people are kind of more tactile learners and they like being hands-on and touching the stuff and learning by doing. So again, it gives an example here. There's difference between reading instructions on how to perform CPR, watching someone perform CPR, and trying CPR in a training dummy. So there's a lot of different ways of learning. And you're going to pick up different information from each of those ways, right? If you just try CPR in a dummy, you may try it out, but you don't know if you're doing it well or right, or right, you don't have much other information besides your attempt and it's a training dummy. So again, you might not know much if it was effective or not. Watching someone perform CPR, you can kind of see it in action and pick up on some things, but you're not going to necessarily know how to do it yourself until you've practiced. And also reading the instructions, you're going to pick up on different things, but you may not understand how all those different items go together until you watch someone and until you try it yourself. So again, having those different modes of learning, engaging different senses of the audience. I mean, if you're doing this presentation on food, having them be able to smell the food, having freshly cooked food there, that can engage another sense for the audience. So they're really engaged in your presentation or tasting it, right? Those taste buds as well, if they're going to taste that food. I'm sure a lot of people would be excited for that. So other type of visual aids, you can do posters or flip charts. Sometimes I tell my students just to print something out. So instead of having a PowerPoint, just print out a visual aid that they can put on a document camera in the classroom, or if they're giving a speech over Zoom, they can hold it up, right? Hold up their visual aid to the camera. So print it out might be a little bit easier to navigate. Sometimes with the technology, with PowerPoints, it takes just as long to get the PowerPoint up as it does to give the presentation, especially when we're doing a bunch of speeches in a row. So if you have it loaded and ready, that can be fine. But other times, sometimes just printing them out can be easier. But posters is another way for giving a presentation, making sure the poster is big enough for the audience to see. You can see some of my diplomas behind me that are tiny. You can't read anything on there or see what that says. So that's not going to be big enough for an audience. If you're, again, that's, just about 10 feet away from me. But no one's going to be able to read that because it's so small. So make sure it's big enough for the audience to see in the back of the room if you are using a poster or a flip chart. I've had people, write on a flip chart, like take ideas, hey, brainstorm ideas, throw them out, and then write them down as part of a visual aid. Or use a whiteboard or a chalkboard to write down different ideas, but then make sure you're writing big enough so the people in the back can see. Make sure you have good markers too. I've certainly taught a class and the whiteboard markers are dried out and not working, so people can't read it well. So again, take that into account as well. Audio and visual video or audio and video. Those are other types of visual aids. So here it says select short clips. If you're going to use a video clip, 10 to 20 seconds, depends on the length of the presentation. Classroom presentations, we're really looking at that 10 to 20 second mark. If it's longer, you want to have it be silent and talking to during it, so you're still engaging your presentation. If you only have 4 minutes for your presentation and 2 minutes of it's just a video, you're not really giving a speech there. You're not really engaging the audience. So make sure the clip is short, make sure it's relevant, make sure it's loaded and so plays quickly. You don't have any issues with that. And make sure the clips are reinforcing the message or appropriate to the topic. If you have audio clips, you may have a little bit of audio if you're talking about music, short little audio clips integrated into your presentation. So again, I've seen some speakers be able to do that where they play the different clips at different moments of the speech. Just again, short 10 to 20 second clips to engage with the audience and show them examples of the information. And multiple 10 to 20 second clips was a longer presentation. It was like 15-minute presentation. So again, figure out how long is your presentation and then how long would it be appropriate to do a clips. If you're giving an hour-long presentation, if you do a 10-minute video in there and talk about it some more, I mean, that's okay, right? If it's an hour long, but it just needs to be a portion of the presentation. The audience still wants to hear from you. They're not just there to watch a video on most occasions. Sometimes there are, people do a presentation, have a public viewing of a video, and then we'll discuss it. So certainly that has happened, and people can do it. But again, just being careful there to make sure your audience is expecting, what are they expecting going into the presentation and setting those ground rules well. And also here, again, the tip, fumbling with technology is a waste of your audience's valuable time. So again, I just say, cut back on the technology, use as little as you're able to. And as a teacher, I certainly have a plan B, right? If technology doesn't work, what's plan B? How am I going to do this without the technology? Or what else, what else are we going to do instead if the technology isn't working? So you might want to think about that plan B in time, just because you might be using a different computer or different setup that's not effective or not working well. Then there are handouts. So you may do a handouts during a presentation or after a presentation. Sometimes people hand out their slides so people can take notes next to the different slides. That can be effective. Other times they have it written in a different format. Again, it takes a little bit more time. The slides are kind of just a quick way of doing it, but just, here are the handout, here are key points, or here's more resources that you can go search. I've had that recently at a presentation. They did their presentation for an hour, then at the end they handed out, here's more resources. I mentioned some of these during my talk, but others I didn't mention, so you can continue doing some research and some follow-up information that's helpful for a handout. People do evaluations if you're giving a conference presentation. People do evaluations at the end, so give that as a handout and say, hey, I want these back, fill these out right now and give these back to me. So that's a type of handout that could fit with a presentation. So there are a variety of different handouts that are effective. Again, figuring out how to distribute the handouts, maybe doing that before the speech presentation starts and start handing out the papers to people. If you have two presenters, maybe one of them does the handouts and another person, keeps talking, or you get a volunteer from the audience to hand out the papers while you're talking. So again, it's figuring out what's appropriate. And again, it's how long is the presentation? If it's a 4 to 6 minute presentation, you probably don't have time to give a bunch of handouts to a group of 30 people. But if you're, if it's an hour-long presentation, you could fit a handout in there if you want to. People appreciate having something to take away, and they don't always have to do all the notes. I've also seen people, instead of a physical handout, saying, we have if you signed up with your email address, I can email out the presentation afterwards with the slides, other notes, other resources. So you can email it to the audience as well. So it doesn't take time during the presentation. And that's also a good tip for staying in contact with the people, right? Building those relationships, networking with the audience to share that information. So here's a slideware, which is just a generic term for PowerPoints. So there's PowerPoint, Apple iWorks Keynote, Google Drive presentation, Zoho Show, and others. So just creating a slide deck. I call it slide deck presentations. I don't hear the word term slideware used commonly. So I just say slide decks. But slideware could also be like a Prezi, where it's not necessarily a deck of slides, but it's one map and it moves around different spots of the screen. So if you use Prezi before, it's cool. It has a lot of good tricks to it, and I've used it before. And you can get really fancy with it. But again, it's just another way of doing a PowerPoint. but slightly different. Pecha is a specific method of using 20 slides that display for 20 seconds per slide and advanced automatically. It generally contains no text, so these are just pictures, so one picture after another, 20 pictures in a row. Maybe a title slide, right? Again, you may have some words on it, but really it's about those pictures. So it began in 2003 to contain the length of presentations and really fit in with that timing. But again, it has to be very prepared and timed out presentation. Every 20 seconds, you have to have what are you going to say during each of those 20 seconds to fit with your slides. It's a very, very refined presentation against 20 minutes. Or sorry, it's not 20 minutes, 20 slides for 20 seconds each. So again, you can do it for a speech, maybe a classroom presentation if you really want to try that style, but it does take a lot of practice to get the timing down right. I talked a little bit about Prezi before. You can go to Prezi to learn more about it. There's a link here. So again, figuring out what works well for that. What sort of, there's other slideware you can use. So again, playing around, having some fun with it and figuring out what fits well for your presentation. Then there are some design principles as well that we'll go through. So with a slide, you really should use some images, some visuals to track the audience and not just having words on it. You may have some words, but you also want to balance it out with some pictures. So here, types of bicycles, you have just bullets here. This is, right, too little information. It's kind of boring. You know, when some pictures of those different types of bicycles, be a little bit more engaging for the audience, or at least one of those types of bicycles. And then this is too much information detailing what each of those are. I mean, this is where the audience is going to have to read the presentation. It's not effective where you may be reading off the slides. Sometimes if there's group presentations in school, you can see who's done the work well, who created the slides, based off how they're talking. Are they being able to add information to the slides, or are they just reading off the slide? You know, students who are reading off the slide, I'm sure you've experienced this as a group project. They're probably not the one that created the slide. They're probably kind of phony in the presentation and didn't contribute as much to the group. So you don't want to be reading off the slides either, right? You want to be talking to the audience, speaking extemporaneously to the audience and not just reading, right? It's called public speaking, not public reading. So you want to speak to the audience. Then again, having images that work well. So this image is a little bit cluttered. It's okay, but it has all this different writing here that you can't really read what each of these are. So maybe get rid of these numbers at the top. And that may be a good place for you to verbalize, you know, where these numbers are. So saying, hey, this graph here I want to point out is about 8,600,000, 8.6 million here versus 6.7 million on this other one. So again, you may add some of that information verbally to the presentation instead of having it cluttered with all these different numbers on the screen here. That talks about low contrast image. So again, you have these two options here. So this one's high contrast, AVPU. So looking at those different letters to help it stand out. You know, this may be distracting, it may be too creative. This one may be too boring. So again, figuring out what's going to work well for your presentation. I don't think either of these are necessarily bad images that wouldn't work well, but again, they're very different on how it can be approached. So looking at how the slides are laid out, so centering the slide, again, you want to make sure that, you know, image in the center here has a little quote, so it has word, it has the slide. And PowerPoint recently has been giving me, you know, like design tips, like how can you, with information you've put on here, let me show you different ways it can be designed. And so it just makes it a little more interesting to follow their design tips. You can look for those yourself as well in PowerPoint. I'm sure other slide presentations have different ways of you know, giving you opportunity to design the slide and giving you some tips. So this is another way. So again, these are two images. This is the same word, but this image is centered. This one's using the rule of thirds. So the person's here in this first third and has these 2/3 kind of where they're going, and also the words are over here. It emphasizes do. So again, looking at these, you get rid of the red bars here, right? The red bars are just to demonstrate the rule of thirds, to show that the words are on the top third and the person's on the right third. So you get rid of these red bars. But again, two different ways of presenting the same information. What works well for your audience and for your situation? Those are things to think about. Then there's the Z pattern for an image. Again, another photography thing. You can learn more about photography things and visual, you know, imagery. If you take a kind of media class of some sort, can be photography, can be, you know, media design, and they'll talk about these things. This is not really what we often cover public speaking outside of just very briefly in this chapter. So there's a ton of more tips that you can go into by taking some of those other classes. Looking away from content. So again, these are two ways of looking at content. So again, where's the person looking on these pictures? Again, both of these are good examples of visual aids where it has an image. Again, an image to attract the audience in very few words. So again, emphasizing the percentage and what does that percentage mean? Then you can have different background and effects, like when things pop in, different, get pictures for the background or just different colors, gradation maybe. So it talks about graphic design here. Graphic design is the paradise of individuality, eccentricity, heresy, abnormality, hobbies, and humors. And that's George Santayana. So again, you can do something that fits your personality, but you also want to make sure it's appropriate for the audience and the occasion. When picking colors, you may want to think about warm colors versus cool colors. You may want to think about complementary colors or analogous colors. Complementary is opposite each other on the color wheel. Analogous is next to each other on the color wheel. So again, thinking about what colors you're using. Maybe you have a color theme for your presentation. You certainly can do that. Different fonts. So serif fonts like Times Newman, Georgia, Platino, sans serif fonts, Arial, Velica, Tahoma, Veranda. So sans serif is if you're giving an electronic presentation, they often recommend using sans serif for a website, whereas serif fonts are for print, for print designing, for printing something off. That's the recommendations I've heard. But again, figuring out what font works well for your presentation, staying consistent throughout the presentation. Maybe you have a couple of fonts that you use for the heading versus the body, but you want to stay consistent throughout your presentation and not just have random fonts throughout. I've seen that with student papers sometimes too. The font will change and it says, oh, they copied this, from somewhere. Maybe they typed it somewhere else, or maybe it's a direct quote that they copied there, and then it changes the font, right? Just go back over at the end and make it one font, one, Times Newman size 12, right? That's pretty common. Or we see Arial size 11 as a pretty common type. So again, using the text, so amount of text should be on the screen, minimize the amount of text on the screen. This quote says no more than 6 words on a slide ever. Other approaches say 5 by 5 rule, no more than 5 lines of text or 5 words per line. Or you could do 6 by 6, 7 by 7. So there's a lot of different recommendations out there for how many words should be on the screen, but they're always maximums, right? You can just have an image, you don't need words, but there's definitely maximums that people pay attention to. If you're writing out paragraphs on the screen, you're not doing it right? You're just wanting some keywords to bring the audience along, maybe a direct quote that's a little bit longer. So again, thinking about what information you're sharing on the screen. If it's too much, it's going to distract them. They're going to be reading instead of paying attention to your presentation. Again, if it's a direct quote, you'll probably verbally say the quote, and they can read along with it. So that's why a direct quote might be okay. But otherwise, just some main information. So this gives an example of a quote on a slide. You have the quote and you have an image to go along with it. Talks about a lot of different images. You can use simplified images. You can use pixelations. So here's a pixelated image. You want to avoid watermarked images, right? Because that means you don't really have an authorization to use the image. So avoid using those watermarks. If you're doing a professional presentation, you may have to pay to get an image, but there are a lot of free websites out there where you can find free images. So here's one free image search base where you can use it. And it's good to use free images as well. There have been cases where students make a classroom presentation and then they post it somewhere, and then someone sues them for using their visuals, like saying, hey, I have copyright over that picture, and start suing the school or even trying to sue the students. So be careful about that. So again, use free images whenever you can. That's the biggest thing, especially if you're going to post it somewhere, right? If you're just using it in the classroom, you may have some academic freedom there to be able to use it just specifically for the classroom. But as soon as it's posted online or posted somewhere else, you don't have that academic freedom anymore. So again, different charts that you can look at. So different ways of representing similar information. This also says SAT scores for Pennsylvania. This one has a lot of data. It may be good to look at trends over time, but you're probably not looking at any of these specific numbers. This one you might look at the specific numbers because there's 8 bars for 4 different comparisons there. And this last one is a different way of representing that same data, looking at how reading scores have gone up and down between 2 periods of time. So graphs and charts, you have to be very thoughtful about how you're representing data. Oftentimes, if I'm using a graph or chart, I use how someone else has represented the data. Where does that data come from and how did they represent it, and put that into my presentation. I don't try and play around with how to make it for myself, but certainly you could. If they don't have a visual that goes along with the data you found, you may want to make a visual of your own. So again, looking at pie charts, line graphs, bar charts, there are a lot of different ways to represent data, and it's what information do you have? Is it talking about how it changes over time? Is looking for comparisons at one point in time, or parts of a whole. So again, figuring out what is appropriate for your presentation. Lots of different options there. Then this last here on implementation. If you have chosen to use visual aids for your presentation, it's important to give credit where credit is due. So make sure you mention the source of your props or the images. You're citing those sources appropriately. You're citing the other content appropriately. I often cite my data at the bottom of the slide. So it's on the same slide the information's from. If you do just have a reference list at the end, like the last slide, I see that's pretty common with students. You also want to use in-text citations to say, hey, what source was used on what slide? And again, so some sort of marks to let people know. You may be verbally citing that in your presentation too, right? It may not be in the visual aid. So it may just be when you're verbally citing it, you'll say, hey, these are where the different sources are used, then have the reference list at the end. Yeah, make sure they're, you've integrated them into your presentation. I did a speech once. It was for a performance class. We had to make up a little play. It was very interesting. It was a very interesting type of communication. Maybe you'll learn more about performance studies, or maybe you have already. But one of the things we practiced our presentation that we're going to do in front of the audience. It was a group presentation. So me and another person. And so we were practicing it. And part of it was we were talking about the World War II and how women were going to the workforce. And part of it, I was going to take off my shirt that I was wearing. I was wearing a button-up shirt, and like, oh, you get off work, you take off your work uniform. I didn't practice it, so it got stuck on my wrist because I was kind of buttoned at the bottom. So like in the middle of the presentation, my partner needed to help me unbutton my shirt, and it was kind of awkward, right? So again, if you're using props, practice your presentation while using the props, right? If you're using visual aids, practice the presentation while using the visual aids. If you're just giving the presentation, talking to yourself in the mirror, but your actual speech has a PowerPoint and you're not using the PowerPoint, right? That may be, you may not be able to integrate, clicking through the slides and how the things are going to pop up and practicing it as a whole, or how much information's on each slide. One of the things I didn't cover yet, but is the idea of having blank slides in your presentation. So if you have a visual aid and then you're not using it anymore, just inserting a blank slide so the screen goes blank and the audience isn't distracted by it until your next piece of information comes up. So blank slides can be effective to, again, have the audience focused on you instead of being distracted by the presentation. So in conclusion, there are a lot of different visual aids that you can be choosing from, including slide decks, objects, audio and visual aids, demonstrations, and they're always there to clarify and enhance your spoken word and help the audience remember your message. They're not there to do the presentation on its own. They're secondary resources to add to your presentation. So any visual that you use adds to what you're saying, and it should be brief, should be complimentary. It shouldn't be distracting to the audience. So allow time for your audience to understand what the visual aid says. If you have words, make sure it's big enough for them to see. That's a huge thing. And just, again, if you're giving handouts, what's on the handouts? Is this going to add to the presentation? Should I hand this out at the end to not distract from the presentation? So again, figuring out how things complement and work together with the words you say. So here's a list of tips that the chapter ends with. Select only visual aids that enhance or clarify your message. Select visual aids that will have the greatest impact on your audience. Speak to your audience, not to your visual aid or the screen. Reveal your visuals when they're relevant to your current point, and take them away when they're no longer talked about. Practice with your visual aids and make sure all demonstrations work smoothly. Design visual aids so they can be understood within 3 seconds. Keep your visuals as simple as possible while still conveying your message. When presenting text to your audience, give them time to read before you begin speaking again, or if it's a direct quote, read the direct quote for them and read it together. And the last one, be prepared to move on with your presentation should any of the visual aids falter or fail. No matter how great your visuals are, you need to be prepared to speak without them. So those are some tips covering the main points from the chapter. but really just be thoughtful about what's appropriate for your topic, for your audience, and for your situation, and design your visual aids from there. Hopefully you're able to take something valuable away from this presentation. You can read through the chapter yourself to gather a little bit more information. There's always activities and glossaries at the end that provide helpful information as well. But thank you for watching the presentation. I appreciate your time, and always feel free to reach out if there's anything I can do to help you with your visual aids or other public speaking tips.